Welcome to the Mechanical PE Exam Prep Podcast, the podcast where I give mechanical engineers like you the tools and motivation to get your professional engineering license and take your career to the next level. In this episode, I speak with Kat, a professional engineer who has been practicing in the state of Washington for 5 years. We look back on Kat's exam preparation, including her strategy and mindset, how she avoided burnout, how she dealt with exam anxiety and imposter syndrome, and how she's now thriving in her career. This episode is full of key themes and common challenges that candidates encounter, so I know you're going to get a lot out of this one. So with that, here's my conversation with Kat. So hello, welcome, Kat. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Excited to have you here.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's been a few years since I took the test. It was, I think, 5 years ago. It seems like a very long time ago because of the pandemic.
Yeah, it
But
probably feels like a world of... So
yeah.
take us from the beginning. Let's kind of step back, maybe as far back as you want to go, maybe all the way to undergrad and kind of the FE. What do you remember from that?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad at UW and went through the mechanical engineering department with a focus on renewable energy. And I think like for most colleges, they advise that you take the FE like during your senior year or shortly after your senior year. So I took it, I think the fall of my senior year in college. And for that one, like I'd never taken, like an engineering exam before. So I didn't quite know exactly what to expect, looked over all the suggestions, got the, TI 36 calculator, practiced with that a little bit, and maybe studied a little bit in the summer. But I didn't really have much time before the exam to prepare. And I think back then I had some test anxiety and was really nervous. But looking back now, it's like, well, most of the people I knew, if not everyone, passed that exam. And,
Right.
I had a friend who was really smart, but he said he just like helped out C for a bunch of the last questions and ran out of time, and he still passed. So,
Wow.
but I really liked the handbook that they gave us. I kind of wish that I had that earlier in college. I just had a good summary of, all the equations that we needed. It was a good review.
I guess one thing you had going for you is just the fact that you did it during your undergrad toward the tail end, which is the same for me. And you're kind of in the groove of dealing with hard exams and, even though it's not a formal engineering exam that's exhaustive, that covers everything, you're in the mode of studying and, just kind of have your student hat on. And that's what's very different about eventually doing the PE later when you've been out of that academic world for a while. So after you got your FE, what were you working on at the beginning of your career?
When I was in college, I was lucky enough to get an internship at a local large utility and spent a couple of summers there. And then after I graduated, I got hired on as a facilities engineer. And I spent a couple of years in that group, did a detail in an energy efficiency group for a couple of years, and then went back to facilities engineering. And the types of designs we were doing were like HVAC and engine generators and plumbing. But our systems are very specific to that company or that utility. So we were our own authority having jurisdiction, and we didn't necessarily require engineers to have the PE license for their jobs. But still, like even though it wasn't required, it was just something that I already always thought about getting. And I didn't want to wait too long after I graduated to get it. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, and I'm not sure how much you can talk about from your prior roles, but what were some of the things that were actually the source of the cooling and power systems that you're working on for the utility? Was it like what was it, specific equipment or transformers, or should I be thinking about the power side, or is it more something else?
It's more for buildings. So, it could be, a data center room or computer room, or just like a storage area. But yeah, we had like a separate group doing like the cooling of the transformer units as well. But we did have like, backup engine generators for, those facilities.
Gotcha. Yeah, I had pretty similar experience at the beginning of my career as well, doing HVAC and refrigeration and power systems for buildings. So there's a lot there, and that sits under that facilities umbrella. So depending on the scale of it, some of it can get repetitive, but I'm sure one of the things that you had your eye on in getting your PE was opening some doors, maybe creating some opportunities to branch out and do some other things. So did you work, you mentioned that it's not really a requirement in that field, or at least at that company, to get the PE. Were you working with any PEs at that point?
Yeah, I was working with a couple of them. I think one was pretty close to retirement and had taken the exam like 20 or 20 or 30 years prior. Another one had taken it like 15 years prior. And I talked to a few, yeah, I talked to a few other engineers who were senior, and I consider them, really good engineers, but they might have tried to take the PE exam a few years before, and they didn't pass the first time, and I don't know if that they pursued it again because it wasn't required. And they plan to stay at that company for life, basically.
Okay.
But I think because they were so good at just like in the field engineering, and that worked for them, they didn't feel the need to get their PE, and they relied on experience rather than studying, from what it sounded like.
Yeah.
Um,
And it didn't go so well for that, some of them.
no, no. But yeah, the ones who did have their PE had gotten it over a decade before that.
Yeah, so you didn't really have anyone specific to kind of look to and give you the roadmap of how to do it. And you did your PE before the transition to computer based, right? So it's
Right.
before 2019.
Or it was in the spring of 2019. Yeah, I think it was
Oh
maybe
wow.
the last test
Wow.
that was written.
Yeah. And I want to point out for anyone listening, because some folks might say, oh, this is from before CBT, so I'm going to tune this out. This isn't relevant. But the exam specification did not change since 2016. It's been the same. So the format has changed. We went from the open book paper and pencil days, where you're using the mechanical engineering reference manual and any other book you want to bring, to the computer-based environment where you're using the reference handbook only. That transition happened in 2019, but the exam spec itself, what the test is about, has not changed since 2016. So, but anyway, coming back to your situation, you kind of looked around, had different folks to kind of maybe take and use some things from, but mostly you had to chart your own course. So what ultimately made you decide to do it and go for it and want to get your PE?
Yeah, so I think I decided around 2018, and that was about 6 years after I'd been out of college. And I was starting to see the industry shifting a little bit for a lot of companies, like a lot more engineers for project engineers. And then, a lot of the design work was maybe getting contracted out. And I really wanted to hold on to that technical ability and skill to do my own designs. And I figured the longer I was out of college, the harder it would be to review that material. And I had a lot of coworkers, like I mentioned, who had taken that PE a long time ago, and they were close to retirement. And soon we wouldn't have any PEs in our group. So I figured, not only would that be helpful for a group, but also give me more of a competitive edge. And since I had focused on utility specific designs for years by that point, I hadn't really branched out and done other types of design since maybe college. So I wanted to, stay a little more flexible. And I guess studying was also kind of a review for me. That's how I approached it. And I know, like, a lot of people don't have this scenario, but I, had a lot of free time. All of a sudden, I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship, and I had all this time, and like, well, it's good to be able to choose to do this instead of being pressured to do it with like a time limit. So that was an opportune time. I definitely chose to take it in the spring because I didn't want to study in the summer. So I decided to sign up and start studying in the winter. And I told my friends ahead of time, I'm going to be a hermit for like 4 or 5 months while I'm studying for this. I wasn't entirely, like, I did like take breaks and hang out with friends, but like, I think the fact that it was winter made it easier to, stay inside and study.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a really conscious decision. And it's a common theme that I hear, that there's something to be said for timing, and there's a time for everything. Sometimes you have to be opportunistic and say, look, this is just what works for me. There's some changes going on right now. I've got some bandwidth, and I don't want to be doing this all summer when it's nice out. So I'm going to study hard in the winter. I'm going to take this thing in the spring. And I really love to hear that kind of long range planning and mindset from engineers, because it is a big commitment. 4, 5, 6 months where you're going to have your head down, and to your point, maybe you can still be a little bit social and kind of stay connected to people, but it's a big change for a while, and you got to make sure it just fits in with what you're doing. And then, so once you kind of had your time blocked out and you knew how you wanted to go about the studying, What was there anything interesting about the application process in your state? What was that like?
Yeah, so in 2019, I haven't actually checked to see if it's changed since then, but we needed to apply and submit our application before signing up for the exam, which I think is a good way to do it, just to make sure, your application gets accepted and you don't go through all that the studying for
Put
for
300 hours
nothing.
in and then they just
Yeah.
tell you.
Yeah. So yeah, I was glad that I was able to have enough time to submit that and get it accepted. I think there are some essay questions that we needed to answer, and we did some sign off from a couple PEs that we worked under, and our supervisor as well. My supervisor wasn't a professional engineer. They were actually an architect, so a licensed architect, but it sounds like that was acceptable too. And so she was able to do a write-up and sign off on that. Yeah, then we needed to do a law review and pass that. And
Is that like a separate exam? I didn't have to do that in New York.
yeah, so it was open book, or we could have the computer open, but it was multiple choice. And I think it was like 90 to 100 questions.
Oh, wow.
That we, had to research and answer correctly.
And this is separate from the exam. You do it ahead of time?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think as part of the application, you need to like print out the results and submit that with it. One of the questions though was like, how many PDHs, is required a year. And I had to like check my answer like 3 times because I'd only heard of, the professional engineers I knew got it in their license in Oregon, and they had to take, a certain amount of hours a year. And then when I couldn't find anything about Washington, I was like, am I missing something? But no, Washington doesn't require PDHs. Yeah.
Well, there you go. So anyone who's like on the border of Washington and Oregon, go for Washington because you don't have to do PDH.
Yeah, that was a relief. But at the same time, as I'll maybe explain more later, it's it's less pressure to keep up with the what you learned, and so there's more risk of losing it.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about the whole PDH thing because I feel like, I mean, to be honest, engineers are just busy in their career, and then this thing comes up every 2 years and they have to carve out time to tick the boxes, so they end up finding something that's really easy to get through and completing the requirements, the minimum requirements. But I think this is just my personal belief, but I think deep down people want to enrich themselves and learn, maybe go deeper on something that they're already strong in, or broaden themselves and discover something new. But there's just never a good time to do that because the projects keep coming and the work keeps coming and life keeps coming. So yeah, I don't know. It's well intentioned, but I think the execution of the whole PDH thing is something I find myself scratching my head about often. But, so how about when it actually came time to get down to studying? How did you think about planning for that? What did you use? And again, for anyone listening, keep in mind, this is still in the open book days. So you might hear some different things in Kat's answer than you would normally hear for the computer-based time, but I'm curious to hear what you did.
I'm interested to hear afterwards about like this new CBT method, but yeah, so I bought the MERM as recommended, and also looked on the NCES website to find out like roughly what percentages of problems would be in each topic, and then I just printed out a couple, or maybe more than a couple, it was like 4 or 5 months of calendar pages, and worked my way backwards from the exam date just to figure out like how much time I had to spend on each topic. And I decided that I wanted to take a trip before I started studying, because it had been really busy at work, and yeah, I was about to spend like 4 or 5 months just like sitting at home in my free time and studying. So a friend of mine and I went to Orlando and went to Universal Studios, and I think that was the perfect like segue into studying. It's like I get to have some free time just to myself before I put my nose down and start studying really hard. So yeah,
I love it.
Once I got back from that, it was like around November, test was in April. Yeah, I just started with the beginning of the book, and looking back, I kind of wish that I had not spent so much time on like the basic stuff like moment of inertia and math. It would have been good just to go straight into heat transfer and all that.
The juicy stuff that is going to be on there often.
Yes, yeah. I don't think I saw one like moment of inertia problem on there. So yeah, I would definitely like focus a lot more on the core topics in there. Um, and so yeah, I started working through the MIRM. I like read through the chapters and did the example problems. I got like I think a Lindbergh practice problem book and also looked through that. But I was a little bit overwhelmed by the problems, like looking at some like example NCES problems. It looked a lot harder than the actual exam problems, and I wanted more practical problems to work on. And I wanted to see someone work through it and what their method was.
Hmm.
So that's when I started like poking around on the internet, and I can't remember if it was either Reddit or YouTube, but I think I saw like one of your introductory videos and decided to look into it. I was also looking at taking a class close by, but the closest one to me was like across the bridge in Portland, which would have been like a total hour commute after work.
Oh,
Would have been like
probably a few
a
nights a
couple,
week, right?
yeah, like 2 or 3 nights a week. And at the time, it would have been like $2,000 or $3,000 more. And I've learned about myself that I do best like with a self-paced learning versus like an in-class environment. And I would have lost that study time to commuting. So yeah, I wanted to find something that was online and self-paced.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know for me it was a similar experience. I thought about taking a live course, and I found one in New York City, which is where I was at the time. I registered for it, and it was expensive, like on the order of what you mentioned. But I didn't really care about that. I figured, I don't want to recreate the wheel. If people have already figured out a good way to go through this content, then I'll bolt myself onto that. And but then they didn't run the course, and then I had to do it on my own. And I felt like using the books and some good books out there, practice problems, things like that, and trying to work through it on my own. It was very hard sometimes, especially some of these more difficult problems. Their written solutions were lacking in detail and not explaining the rationale. And I thought there's got to be something in between these two options where you don't necessarily want the schedule commitment of the live course. You certainly don't want the commute taking away from your study time, but you want a little bit more meat on the bone than just here's a 3-line written solution. And it's like, well, why use that formula, not this other formula? And you can ask a question. So there needs to be something that's in between that keeps you working independently, but also gives you a little bit more context if you need it for a given problem. So I'm glad that that the program was able to help you. What else surprised you about going through the program, or just the study process, or how things kind of shifted once you got going on that?
Yeah, I think it was just
like how did you find yourself using it?
Yeah, I first started like reading a bunch, and I felt like I needed to gain a bunch of that knowledge back before I started working through the problems, because I didn't want to just start working through them and basically learning about that specific problem and not all the concepts around it. So I definitely spent a lot more time reading in the beginning, and trying to get through that first. And I think I saved the problems for kind of towards the tail end of my study, which I mean is still like maybe 2 months or so before the actual exam.
Oh, wow.
But
So you really did not focus on practice problems in that early 2-3 months. You kind of held off on that. And then is that right to say that you kind of then in the last 2 months, you just did loads of practice problems?
Well, I did like some practice problems here and there, like, as I was reading, but they were more like from the MIRM and so, but not like NCES specific problems until like kind of before, which is probably a little more unconventional than
I know. The reason I asked such specific questions is just because I think one thing that I want listeners to know is that part of going through this process of preparing yourself for the PE exam, you don't exactly know precisely what you need to do every day. There's a bit of discovery. So I think if I'm understanding your story right, at the beginning, you had big eyes for the MIRM and reading almost everything and, really going through everything in a lot of detail. And then it was only once you started down that path that you realized this is going to take way too long. And you honestly wanted to do it. It wasn't realistic, but you didn't want to go so far to the other end of the spectrum where it's like, nope, I'm just going to do practice problems. And then it's super specific and you only learn about what that exact problem is about and not all of the tangential and adjacent problem types that you could get that are related to that idea. That feels like a mistake because you're missing out on it. So, where's the middle ground? And at the first 2 or 3 months, you're grappling with, should I be doing more? Should I be doing less so that I can go faster? And you're always going to feel a little bit uncertain about that. And that's okay. That's normal. That's expected. If you're totally lost and you're just reading and wasting time, that's not good. But if you're drilling on problems and then just crossing your fingers and hoping that you've seen it before and it works out, then that's not really a great plan either. So I really get a sense of that kind of humility in the way you tell it, like you weren't sure.
Yeah. So I like you said, it was like the first time I had taken the test. And even though I'd like try to research online what other folks had done, I kind of knew what my comfort zone was, even though it was like, getting into a bit of detail. Because I guess that's part of my curiosity too, is like, I want to know why this happens or why that happens. And it's like, okay, well, actually, I'm still preparing for an exam where I have to, go through problems. It's not just learning,
Right.
more about this topic.
Yep. Yeah. You have to almost, turn that off to a degree, which, if that curiosity is not there and somebody just wants to tick the box, like some folks want to pass the exam as fast as possible. They don't really care how much like permanent learning actually happens as a part of that. But I'm a firm believer that that actually makes it harder. Because if you have genuine curiosity, then when the going gets rough and you're like struggling with a problem, you'll find more resources within yourself to work through it. And that doesn't necessarily just mean like thinking harder or working longer. It could mean that you're working the problem in the background while you're doing other things, going about your day. You're like, oh, that problem today, that was something about that's bothering me, but you keep grinding on it. And then the connections form in the spaces between the study sessions. And that accumulates over months, but you can't do that, in a 2 or 3 week cram session.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny that I was, studying so much and my brain was thinking about it so much. Like at one point, after like a shower, like, I had wet hair and I was wondering, okay, I wonder what the relative humidity in this room is and like how long it would take my hair to dry. I just let it air dry. So I just started thinking about, those problems or those concepts in my everyday life, which was kind of funny.
Yeah, it's random things that happen. I had one like that too. A colleague asked a question about, I was traveling in Hong Kong for work and it's very hot and humid there. And I like to run. So I got to know some guys over there and there were some ultra runners that would go out and they like to run at night. So they wouldn't have the heat, but it's still very humid. And they asked questions about, how to stay cool and heat rejection and what's actually going on. And I think I wrote this like, I don't know, 1,000-word email or I started small and then it just became a monster. I sent it out and it's one of my most proud creations.
Yeah, I mean, like
so
it's
absurd.
Pure curiosity and interest in what you do. So yeah, those are great.
So it's we're here for the license and getting the successful result, but we're also here to nerd out a little bit too. So it's a balance. Anything that you got snagged on during your study process?
So I think that just being out of school for 6 years, there were things that I had forgotten and I was made well aware that I had forgotten about them. I think like, some of the steam tables and flipping back and forth and making sure I had the right one, and getting like comfortable enough with that process that like I know that during exam day when I'm like, nervous and time limited, that I could do that without a mistake was something that I felt like I needed to do is like study more with the, what I would be using for the exam. So I think that when I get nervous, I over prepare, and I don't know if how the exam now looks different, but I put together this binder of blank psychometric charts, the most useful tables from the MERM in the back of the book that I just wanted to be able to flip to really easily. I saw some good advice about putting the index of the MERM in a binder because if you're flipping back and forth through the MERM, it's kind of hard to like go back to the index and then go back to the page you need.
That is great advice. It's lost on today's audience, but man, that was such a pro tip back in the pre-2019 days. I did that too, and it helped me more than I expected. Because you're constantly in and out of the index, and you don't also want to be flipping around the book.
And just like putting together equation sheets was nice because there's just so many different variables. Like sometimes like one letter could mean like 3 or 4 different things. So just having those sheets that I made myself while I was studying and going through the practice problems and saying what they meant was really helpful. And I guess another thing was maybe units. Like I can't stress it enough is there are some problems that I was doing. It's like I would have gotten right the first time. I think if I had slowed down a little bit and made sure I did the unit conversions correctly. And I don't know if it was you or one of my professors back in college, but they had a way to break down the units. So that was really easy to tell that you were canceling out all the ones you needed to. And it was just, I think, one long bar and then, some vertical lines separating all the numbers and values. And then making sure that the units all had their own separate cell in that sheet. So I think that really helped a lot.
That is another pro tip for candidates out there. You got to be a stickler about the units. What a shame to read a problem, right? Figure out the roadmap, I got all this given information. This is the stuff I need. This is the stuff I don't. These are the formulas I'm going to use. These are the steps I'm going to take. This is the data I'm going to collect, and work that whole problem correctly. Just answer the question wrong at the very end because they wanted it in one unit and you offered it in another. That's something that we all get burned on a number of times. Hopefully most of those times are during practice, and we can limit the number of times that happens in an exam environment. So listening to you now, I can tell that you did a really good job preparing, and there's probably a decent chance that you were over prepared. We'll never know because you find out that you passed, and you don't get to know what specific problems you got right or wrong. But how did you just intuitively know? Was there a point where you felt ready?
So before I took the exam, about like 3 weeks beforehand, I scheduled a time like in a local library and reserved a room for about 10 hours. And luckily I did it ahead of time enough, like a few weeks before that I was able to get a spot for the whole day, and really tried to simulate the test environment. So, just brought the books that I would have, calculator, snacks and lunch, and took the NCES practice exam.
And you hadn't looked at it before. That was your first.
Yes. Yeah. I hadn't looked at it before. I wanted it to be as close to the actual thing as I could get it. But when I was going through the problems and correcting it, it's like, wow, I only got like 50 or 60%. Like, oh man. But I think other people had similar experience. Like the first time they took a practice exam, like it wasn't as great as I'd hoped. And then
right.
Took time after.
Put in a lot of time before that point, and you're just a few weeks out. So you get a 50 or 60% result. You're kind of like, boy, have I been spending my time wisely? So that wasn't a great feeling.
No. So I looked at those problems I missed and really tried to go back and redo them, and make sure that I understood them. Unfortunately, I didn't really have much time to take the practice exam again, but I did look through the other exam that I had, which was like, I think the Lindbergh one, and just went through some of the problems, kind of in a more laid back environment. However, I wasn't as stressed about that one because, I was told that one's more difficult than the actual exam. So it was just extra practice for me beforehand. But I think the moment I remember, like, I felt like I was more ready was I had a question about like sound that was in the room. And I saw that like that was one of the possible topics on the exam. So
supporting topics, right?
Yeah. And I made sure I just wanted to review it and make sure I like scanned it at least, but I had a question about it. And I asked you about that topic, and I think you gave me some good information, but then at the end you said, well, if you're asking about sound, I think you're well on your way. I think you covered the important topics. So yeah, it's like, okay, yeah, if he thinks that, I've covered everything. I know that I tend to over prepare and go through everything, make sure I covered all the stuff.
Yeah.
Then it's probably fine.
I still find myself a bit conflicted today when people ask about supporting topics because they're clearly written on the exam spec in black and white. But for the longest time, the HVAC and refrigeration program that you went through, thermodynamics, fluids, psychrometrics, heat transfer, and then HVAC systems and components. And that's the main course. Like those are the most important things. And if we go deep on all of those, my claim is that people will have enough in the tank to pass. And for the longest time, that's all we had. But after enough time, people said, well, what about acoustics? What about vibrations? What about economics? These topics are supporting topics. So I said, okay, we'll put a supporting topics module together and we put that in there. But you want to kind of do a light touch on that stuff. And that's sort of where you were at. You were doing a few problems about it. And I guess I was able to help you a little bit technically, but more than anything else, just to kind of say, if you've buttoned everything up and the last little bit is acoustics, we're going to be good here.
Yeah.
What do you remember about your exam day?
So
I know it's been a while.
Yeah, that's so long ago before the global pandemic. Yeah, so I had to travel like 2.5 hours north from where I live to take the exam, but it was in the city that I'm from. So I actually went with my family up there, and it was almost like a mini vacation for them. But they, visited some friends and family while I took the test. But the day beforehand, made sure to drive by the test location and figure out, parking, like before, and then what to do after the exam, and have everything ready the night before. So I could go in feeling relaxed, not already stressed. So that I think helped a lot, is just kind of visualizing the next day. It might sound a little cheesy, but it's like, yeah, I want to make sure that I know how to get there and, what it will look like. But yeah, I got there early. And I felt like fortunate enough to sit towards the front of the room. It was a large room full of like all different engineers. And because I sat in the front, I didn't, for me, like, because I had a little bit of test anxiety, just not seeing all the people in there and just kind of being able to focus on my test only was really helpful. I think probably getting there early helps with with my seating for sure. And
That's good. You knew that
yeah,
about yourself, that you could potentially be a bit anxious, and you kind of had a strategy for that. You were going to have all your logistics handled. You were going to be there early. You were going to try to get a seat toward the front, and that helped you.
yeah, for sure. And you know what? Some coworkers had like told me stories about taking the exam and people having suitcases full of books and
Oh yeah.
yeah, I don't know if that's the case anymore where people are allowed to take in that many books, but
They don't even let
that
you have
sounded
your cell phone now. You get
oh
nothing.
wow.
They give you a little pad and a marker, and that's it.
Wow, it's changed a bit in
Oh
the
yeah.
5 years. But I feel like that would have been a little intimidating for me as a test taker. It's like you have all these reference books that you didn't necessarily use while studying. And yeah, you might spend more time trying to look through them for the answer than actually thinking about it. So
Yeah.
it might have been more of a security blanket at the time, but yeah, I only used like 2 or 3 of the books I brought, and I didn't bring that many.
That's a good
So
sign to me. I was very similar. I just had the Merman and a couple other things, but it was very light. I definitely remember being lined up outside the building before going in and seeing the people with the carts and the milk crates and the suitcases. Not everyone, but a fair number of people like that, and just thinking, did I miss something here? Because I know a couple of books fairly well, but if it's not in there, I'm prepared to take my guess and move on. But maybe these folks know something I don't, or so it's I guess that comparison factor isn't really there anymore for folks in the CBT environment. They're just scheduling a date and walking in and sitting in front of a computer. The person to your left and right could be doing completely different exams, and you're partitioned off from them. So I guess it's kind of a positive that comparison is gone. But at the same time, I think it makes people intensely curious about what they should expect and how they should be preparing and what they should be using. So it sort of opens all those questions up even farther.
yeah, and I think they probably won't find this useful now, but I think one of the most handy books that I brought that was a little unexpected was that ASHRAE Pocket Guide. I used it while studying, and one of the reasons I ended up getting it was because I thought it would be handy even after the exam.
Yeah.
I like those little pocket books because sometimes like the mechanical rooms I go to or the sites I go to don't have good cell reception, so it's I can't really look or check anything online. I might not have brought like, psychrometric charts with me or anything like that. So just having something that's portable was really nice. And being familiar with it because of the studying for the exam was also really helpful.
Isn't it
So
great when the exam and the work and the things that we're studying actually dovetails with our work? It's just
yeah.
it's like, wow, there's a reason why I'm doing all this. So when did you find out that you passed? What was that like?
So I found out like 3 weeks or so
Oh,
afterwards.
that's very quick. And nowadays
Yeah.
that would be considered long, but then that was incredibly quick.
Yeah, everything was on paper. And I think it was around that time because I'd also like scheduled a trip after the exam. It could have been a consolation trip or a celebratory trip. I didn't know, but I wanted to like celebrate the end of this studying with a trip to France. And I had, been studying French a little bit here and there. And so it's like, yeah, I mean,
You were studying French in parallel with studying for the
oh
PE exam?
no, I studied like a couple years before that, and
Okay.
had just kind of brushed up a little bit here and there, kind of as
Wow.
a break to studying. Just HVAC, it's good to balance it out with another topic, just because you don't want to get burned out on one topic like after a few months. Study maybe something else you enjoy too.
Yeah.
That's so yeah, I found out like shortly before I left for my trip, and like many have said, it's just a pass or fail, and you don't really get to see by how much. You don't know if you just barely passed or like comfortably passed. So that actually was a relief, but also like I started to question myself. Like I know it was like maybe not a good feeling. It's like relief, but then like, oh, did I deserve this by a lot? Or, am I just like barely making it by? Like there's also a little bit of guilt. Like, oh, what about these people who, did really well, but just happened to not be having a good day or anything.
Yeah, missed
And
by one question.
right. So it's yeah, it felt like a little unearned, which sounds crazy because I worked with engineers who were a lot older than me, had a lot more experience, and they didn't have those 2 letters after their name.
And you
and you
did
can't
now.
really, and I did, but they had like 20 or 30 years of experience sometimes. And, if you email a group of people, they don't know who you are. They tend to see those two letters and say, oh, this person has authority, like they have their license. And so I, almost felt like saying like, okay, my license with this person, has a lot of practical experience. So it was a weird dynamic for me
Yeah,
to
I'm really
figure
glad
out.
you shared that. I think that that's an underdiscussed topic about this kind of almost imposter syndrome that we have. Even though you had the experience, you did the work, you went through the application process fair and square, and you prepared yourself incredibly well. So you earned those letters, no two ways about it. And yet there you are, checking your results, finding out you passed, you're relieved, and then the relief lasts for all of a minute. And then right away is this kind of this like, well, how well did I do? Did I get by the skin of my teeth, or did I ace this thing? And we'll never know. So you just, and then, yeah, it's interesting. It's like, it's only one piece to the puzzle. And I think that's really the thing to take away is that it's something that people aspire to get their PE. And it's definitely something to be proud of once it's been accomplished. But it's not like the end of the road. It's a stepping stone in your career that enables you to take on more and new responsibility. It opens doors, and it absolutely does reflect a minimum level of competence that you now show to the rest of the professional world, and the letters are a shortcut for communicating that. But there's still a lot of work to be done. There's your network, there's your reputation, and there's your performance every day, and the integrity with which you carry yourself. And I like the reason why I'm so excited to have these conversations with engineers like you is because what connects us is not just the letters and the process that we went through, it's the intellectual curiosity that we share. And I'm a firm believer that in the long course of people's careers, that's actually going to make a difference. And that's the secret reason why I do what I do. The headline reason is to help people get their PE, but the big story is that I actually want to inspire people to keep learning even after they've done that, and to bring that mentality into their teams and their companies, because that's a better place to work, and a better work environment to be in. But that's my idealism, I guess. You passed, you got it done. What do you take away from the whole thing? Do you have maybe some advice, just as we're wrapping up here, that you would leave candidates with that want to follow in your footsteps and are considering going down this path as well?
Yeah, so after I got my license, nothing really changed immediately for me. As I mentioned, like it wasn't required for my job. I did put it on my resume, and I applied for a couple jobs, and one of those jobs was a bit different from what I had been doing. And honestly, like that group that I applied for had, it was also in my company, and it was hard to get a spot there, but I had my eye on it. And it was more geared towards like a machine design and testing than, HVAC systems. And so I just took this PE exam and got my license like 2 or 3 years before I applied for this position. So it was a different subject. So yeah, I'll have to ask you how that applies if, I got my PE in HVAC, but then I'm working in machine design. But yeah, it was interesting. Like even though I put the PE letters and information on my resume, like I didn't feel like flaunting it. Like it, it was also kind of maybe that guilt or feeling like I wanted to prove myself through experience rather than just having that license. So yeah, I got that job in the testing group, and honestly it's been really fun, and one of the reasons why I was drawn to it is because it is more hands-on engineering. I'd actually be doing those problems or similar things to what I was doing when I was studying for the exam, and then I'd actually get to design something and test it. So yeah, like for me personally, it was kind of a dream job where you carry something from concepts all the way to fabrication and then testing. So it was testing like my initial calculations or initial design and seeing whether I was right. So
Right.
yeah, so maybe that's kind of maybe some fulfillment there where it's like, okay, I'm actually doing these problems and now I get to find out if I was correct or not, and physics doesn't lie. So yeah, it's pretty honest.
I love that. I think a lot of folks get the PE for different reasons, and they're all different, and there's nothing right or wrong about any of it. I think in your case, you wanted to do something that was a little bit more technical than what you'd been doing before, and you found a way to do that. And there's folks who are looking to open a different door. There's folks who have done some technical work in the first 5 years of their experience, and they want to move into more of a project management role, or they want to work more with people, or they want to work more on the business side. They may take a different trajectory. And there's nothing right or wrong about any path. Everybody has to chart their own path in their career and kind of figure out what they want to move toward. And we also have the right to change our minds, because we change over time and maybe our interests will move with that. But I love hearing how you were able to make that change and land the role that, like you said, there weren't a lot of spots like that, and you pulled it off within a couple of years of getting your PE. So I definitely think you kind of manifested that in a way.
Yeah, and it's funny that even though it's more like machine design, I still do some HVAC calculations. There's a couple buildings in my group and they needed some heating and cooling and they didn't have any already. So I did some calculations for that. We're also getting an environmental chamber, so we have to make sure we have the power to support it and the cooling tower capacity to
Oh,
support
and you're
it.
definitely the
Yeah.
person on the team that's going to go to, because that's part of
Yeah.
your brand.
Yeah, exactly. So it was really good timing. And luckily, I still have the resources from studying for the exam and everything to be able to reference for that. So it was cool having a real life problem that was similar to, preparing for the exam.
That's awesome.
But yeah, any last advice? I had a really good support system. I luckily have family in the area and friends in the area. I didn't tell a whole lot of people that I was studying because, I don't like the additional pressure and expectation.
Right. You kept it to the inner circle.
Yeah, exactly. And, I got the chance to set some time aside for myself after work or on the weekends. And sometimes I'd go to a friend's house or family's house to study if I wanted to have no distractions. Not everybody has that, but just finding a way to feel supported if possible, because it's a long process, and sometimes you won't be able to do the regular things that you like to do, like cook for yourself or hang out with friends or garden. So it's helpful to have someone in your circle, even if it's like a coworker who's checking in on you, make sure you're doing all right. And then also, because it was kind of a lonely time, it was winter and, I wasn't seeing friends as often as I was, I had to learn to also be more kind to myself. And I think that it helped that I was able to choose to take the test instead of being pressured by circumstances or work. And because I was choosing it, I felt less pressure on myself to pass the first time. I was able to say, I'm going to give it all I have and how I know best to study. But if it doesn't work out this time, then maybe I can try again, try a different approach. But I obviously wasn't ready this time if I didn't pass. Maybe I just missed it by 1 point, but I knew of people who took it multiple times and it's not out of the ordinary. So and I figured, when I took it again, I would not be starting from scratch. I already had, some materials, and I think I still had access to your course.
You still do.
So yeah, oh yeah, I do. Yeah, so that didn't expire. If I wanted to take it in another state, maybe I could review it again. But yeah, I think that just saying, okay, this is an investment, and like a lot of things in life, you can invest the time, but nothing is guaranteed. So it's not like it'd be nice if you passed that after putting in all that effort, but there's a chance that it might not work out.
Yeah.
And so being willing to forgive yourself, was the biggest thing.
I really like that. I really like that. And I want to underline what you said about doing something by choice and the framing that you have for that, of choosing to do something as opposed to being forced. I can think of a very simple example of this for me, like back in school when I was, running cross country. I would say, I have to go to practice. Like it's a burden. I have to go. Right? Do you have to go, or do you choose to go? If you asked me then, I would say I have to go. But now if I go out and go for a run for exercise, I say I get to go. I'm sad if I don't get to go. It's the same activity. It's exactly the same thing. It's one foot in front of the other many, many times over. So just to be able to be in an environment where you're choosing to do something, because it's hard, like you said, for all the reasons you gave. It's winter, it's dark, it's lonely. You're trying to do something that's difficult, it makes you think, and it makes you kind of get frustrated sometimes, and that's part of the process. It's nice if you're doing it by choice and not by force.
Definitely. So I think that, looking back, I'm really grateful that I passed when I did, because I probably, if I had to take it again, wouldn't take it until the spring of 2020. And I think most exams were canceled or rescheduled.
Wow. So had it not happened then, it could have been 2-3 years.
Yeah. And that would have been a little more difficult to pick up and study again,
Wow.
I think. So yeah, I got really lucky. And I think about that a lot.
Luck favors the prepared.
Yeah, over prepared. And my work, I don't know if others have this option, but they cover the cost of my exam because I passed the first time. If I had done
Oh,
it more
if you
times,
pass.
like the first time, yeah.
I like
And
that little incentive. That's a good kick for folks.
yeah, and I kind of planned on not getting that reimbursement, but it was
Mhm.
just a nice little extra when I did pass, and it covered, some of what I spent on studying materials
Right.
and all that.
That's fantastic. What else, Kat? Anything we missed before we part ways here? This has been fantastic.
Not that I can think of. Yeah, it's kind of crazy to think it was like 5 years ago. It just seemed like it was a very long time of studying and preparing. And you know, like when I was like talking to other engineers my age or who were going for the exam, I didn't really know them very well, but they're like, "Oh yeah, that's easy. I'm just gonna study like 1 or 2 months before the exam. I heard it's really easy." And I felt like a little bit intimidated at first. Like, am I like over preparing? Like, am I, just not as smart as these folks? But I think that, yeah, it's good to be humble and say like, okay, yeah, maybe they might feel comfortable preparing 1 or 2 months, but that's their exam and that's their experience. Like, I want to do what I know I'm comfortable with and will help me prepare and
Right.
set aside the time.
That's a
So
much
yeah.
better mentality. The goal is not to talk about it in a way that makes you sound impressive. The goal is to go away and do the work and get the result that you desire. And it's your own experience and nobody else's. Awesome. Well, that's a great place to leave it there, Kat. I really appreciate you coming on. This has been a lot of fun, and there's been a lot of great wisdom in the arc of your story here. So I'm excited to share it with a lot of candidates who want to do what you've done.
Great. Well, thanks, Dan. Okay.
Take care, Kat.
See ya. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Mechanical PE Exam Prep Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review to help other engineers find the podcast. And if you're looking for a program that will help you pass the PE exam, check out the full access bundle available at mechanicalpeexamprep.com, and feel free to reach out with any questions. I would be honored to be your guide on the journey to becoming a professional engineer.